Evelyn had never been one to believe in ghosts. She always prided herself on being practical, grounded in the reality of medicine and the cold, hard facts of science. Yet, as the taxi pulled up to the desolate hospital gates, a deep unease settled in her chest. The building loomed before her like a dark, silent giant, its tall windows like empty eyes staring back at her. The once grand structure, now abandoned for decades, had been notorious for its long history of strange occurrences and mysterious disappearances. But Evelyn needed the job. She had no choice. The local news had spoken of the old hospital with fear and reluctance, calling it cursed, haunted, a place better left forgotten. But to Evelyn, it was simply an opportunity, a nursing position with excellent pay, even if it was at an institution with a rather unsettling reputation. As she stepped out of the taxi and onto the cracked, overgrown driveway, the wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying with it the faintest scent of something old: mildew, dust, and a strange metallic tang. She shivered despite the warmth of the day, instinctively pulling her jacket tighter. The doors of the hospital creaked open as she stepped inside, the scent of decay overwhelming her senses. The entrance hall was vast, its marble floors cracked and covered in grime. Faded paintings of smiling doctors and patients lined the walls, their once bright colors now dulled by age. The air felt heavy, thick with the silence of abandonment. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "Welcome, Evelyn," the voice startled her. She turned to find a tall, middle-aged man standing in the doorway. His pale face was expressionless, his uniform crisp and clean, as if it had been freshly pressed for this very moment. "Dr. Hill," she replied, offering a small smile. "I wasn't expecting anyone. Not many come here anymore," Dr. Hill said, his voice low and steady. "But you'll find your way. It's an easy job, really. Just make sure to stick to the schedule and follow the rules." Evelyn nodded, though a part of her wondered what rules Dr. Hill was referring to. She had heard stories, of course, about nurses and staff who had worked here only to quit after a few days. One had gone missing. Another had left with her mind shattered, babbling about things she couldn't explain. But these were just rumors, right? She was a professional. She had no reason to worry about silly stories. As they walked down the long corridors, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the oddness of it all. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the hallway. The walls, though mostly intact, seemed to warp slightly, as if the building was shifting in subtle, unsettling ways. Every now and then, she thought she saw something move out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. "This way," Dr. Hill said, pushing open a heavy door. "Your quarters." Evelyn stepped into the room, which was small but functional. A simple bed, a desk, and a single window that overlooked the overgrown courtyard. As she unpacked her things, the strange sensation of being watched lingered in the air. She couldn't shake it, no matter how hard she tried. The hospital was old, yes, but there was something else about it. Something off. Something that felt as though it had been alive once, and now it simply existed in a state between life and death. "Don't worry about the sounds at night," Dr. Hill had warned her earlier, his expression hardening for a moment. "It's just the building settling. You'll get used to it." That night, as Evelyn lay in her bed, she tried to ignore the unsettling sounds around her. The creaks and groans of the old hospital echoed through the halls, each noise amplifying her sense of unease. She could hear footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving just outside her door. Then, the unmistakable sound of a door opening and closing, as if someone was walking the halls, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. She sat up, her breath caught in her throat. The room felt colder now, the temperature dropping so quickly that she could see her breath misting in the air. Slowly, she crept to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She opened it cautiously and stepped out into the hallway. The corridor was empty, but as she looked down the long stretch of darkness, she couldn't help but notice something that made her skin crawl. The faint glow of a light flickering at the far end of the hall, where the old nurse's station once stood. She didn't remember Dr. Hill mentioning anything about the lights being on. In fact, the station had been abandoned long ago. No one had used it in years. Yet, the light was flickering, as if someone had just been standing there, watching her. Evelyn took a step forward, but then stopped, her heart racing. She thought she saw something move in the shadows at the end of the hall. A figure hunched over, moving slowly towards her. Her breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, only continued to move, its footsteps dragging across the floor with an eerie, slow rhythm. Evelyn didn't wait any longer. She turned and ran back to her room, locking the door behind her. She pressed her back against it, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her mind raced with questions. Who was that? What was happening in this place? She glanced at the clock on her bedside table. It was past midnight, her first night, and already, she had experienced something unexplainable. She lay back in bed, pulling the covers up around her. But sleep didn't come easily. The hospital was silent now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still out there, watching. As the night stretched on, Evelyn's thoughts swirled, her mind torn between logic and the creeping suspicion that she wasn't alone in the hospital. Something was wrong here, something dark. Evelyn had spent the entire next day trying to push the events of the previous night from her mind. She tried to tell herself that it was just the stress of starting a new job, the isolation of being in an old, abandoned hospital, and the strange noises that come with any old building settling. But deep down, something gnawed at her. As she walked down the long, narrow hallways that afternoon, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was always just a step behind her. Every time she turned a corner, every time she passed a doorway, she half expected to see a shadow lurking in the periphery. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark silence that filled the hospital. The nurse's station, which she had seen only briefly the night before, now stood like a forgotten relic of the past. The faint light that had been flickering the night before was now gone. The area was empty, its old desk covered in layers of dust, the chairs abandoned, as though no one had worked there for years. Yet, as Evelyn lingered there, she thought she saw something. A scrap of paper, fluttering ever so slightly as though caught by the wind. But there was no window, no open door, nothing that could explain the movement. She felt a chill race up her spine. Shaking her head, she quickly turned away, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She needed to focus on her job. She couldn't let these silly thoughts control her. Later that evening, just as the sun began to set, Dr. Hill appeared again. His face was the same, pale, tight, his eyes seemingly unreadable. Evelyn greeted him with a nervous smile. "How are you settling in, Evelyn?" he asked in his usual quiet, calm tone. "I'm doing all right," she replied, still feeling the unease from earlier. "But I can't help but notice how strange it feels here." Dr. Hill's expression barely changed, but there was a slight shift in his posture. A subtle, almost imperceptible sign that something was off. "The hospital has its own rhythm," he said, his voice low. "It takes some getting used to, but you'll adjust. Just follow the schedule and don't stray from your duties. It's for your own safety." Evelyn nodded, her thoughts swirling. The strange, cryptic way he spoke unsettled her. There was something about his words that didn't sit right with her. "Of course," she said, trying to sound calm, even though the tension in her chest was rising. "I'll stick to the schedule. I'll make sure everything is in order." Dr. Hill gave a short nod before turning to leave. But as he reached the door, he paused for a moment. "One more thing, Evelyn," he added without turning around. "There are certain areas of the hospital you should avoid. Some places aren't meant to be entered." Evelyn's curiosity flared. "What do you mean? Are there parts of the hospital that are off limits?" Dr. Hill's back stiffened for a brief moment. Then he spoke, his voice softer than before. "Just don't go into the old wing. There's nothing there but memories. It's best to stay away." He walked out of the room without another word, leaving Evelyn standing there, feeling more uneasy than ever. That night, Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the thoughts that were racing through her mind. What was in the old wing of the hospital? Why was Dr. Hill so adamant about keeping her away from it? And what did he mean by memories? She was about to close her eyes and try to sleep when she heard it. The sound of footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing down the hallway outside her door. It was late, well past midnight. No one should have been walking around at this hour. Her heart began to race. She held her breath, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, as if someone had stopped right outside her door, the noise stopped completely. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears as she slowly rose from her bed, her hand shaking as she reached for the door. She cracked it open, just enough to peer out. The hallway was empty, but the air felt colder now, heavier, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. She stepped out cautiously, her footsteps soft against the cold, hard floor. The hospital was eerily quiet, and for a moment, she thought perhaps she had imagined the footsteps. Then, she heard it again, a faint whisper. The words were indistinguishable, but the sound of it made Evelyn's skin crawl. It was coming from the far end of the hall, from the direction of the old wing. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what drew her toward it, whether it was curiosity or the strange pull she felt to discover the truth behind the whispers. But she couldn't resist. Slowly, she started walking down the hall, the soft click of her shoes echoing in the silence. With each step she took, the whispering grew louder. It was as though someone or something was calling her name. Evelyn. The sound of her name was unmistakable. It was soft, almost soothing, but there was something about it that made her blood run cold. She had to find out what was happening, what was making that sound. The air grew colder as she neared the old wing, and Evelyn shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The whispering stopped suddenly, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. She stood in front of the entrance to the old wing, the door slightly ajar, as though waiting for her. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Should she go in? Should she turn back? The decision was made for her when the door creaked open on its own, slowly, as though pushed by an invisible force. Evelyn took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest, and stepped inside. The darkness was thick and suffocating. The faint glow of the emergency lights only illuminated parts of the hallway, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The smell of decay was stronger here, mixed with something faintly metallic, like blood. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone to use as a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing old, forgotten rooms, each door slightly ajar. She moved forward, feeling the weight of each step. The whispering was gone, but the air felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't place. As she passed one of the rooms, her light flickered briefly. For a split second, she saw something, a shadow, moving just beyond the doorway. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Something was there. Evelyn stood frozen in the hallway, the beam of her phone's flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadow had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the faint echo of her heartbeat in her ears. She couldn't decide whether it was just her imagination playing tricks, or if something truly was lurking in the dark corners of the old wing. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air in the hallway felt heavier now, thick with an unnatural chill that made her skin prickle. She had to know what was going on. She had to find out what was in this place that Dr. Hill was so determined to keep her away from. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn stepped forward, her shoes softly scraping against the worn floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. As she passed the rooms, each one seemed to whisper its own secret, each door slightly ajar, as if inviting her to explore. The old wing felt different from the rest of the hospital. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the floors were cracked and uneven. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, mixing with something far more unsettling, a faint, lingering scent of decay. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she walked deeper into the darkness. Her phone's flashlight flickered again, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. She tried to steady her hand, but her mind raced. What was it she had seen before? Was it just her mind playing tricks on her, or was something truly in that room? She continued down the hallway, the tension growing with each step. The building felt alive, as though it was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Then she heard it, a faint rustling, like soft footsteps on the floor. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, straining her ears. The sound came again, this time closer. Someone or something was moving in the shadows, just out of sight. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she crept toward the source of the noise. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence returned. But now something felt different. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. She stood still for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers from earlier had returned, faint but unmistakable. They weren't in any particular language, just a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her breath caught in her throat. Evelyn, her name. It was the same soft whisper she had heard earlier, but this time, it came from directly behind her. Evelyn spun around, her phone's light flashing wildly, but there was no one there. Just the long, empty hallway stretching behind her, its shadows deepening in the dim light. Her mind raced. She had to get out of here, but something deep inside her urged her to keep going, to uncover whatever secret the hospital was hiding. Taking a hesitant step forward, she approached one of the rooms at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open, the darkness beyond it thick and impenetrable. She couldn't see anything inside, but she could feel the weight of it, the heavy presence that seemed to pulse in the air. She reached for the door, her hand shaking, and slowly pushed it open. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound sharp in the oppressive silence. As she stepped inside, her flashlight illuminated the room, revealing old medical equipment covered in dust, forgotten charts scattered across the floor, and cracked windows letting in only a faint sliver of moonlight. The room felt abandoned, but there was something else, a presence that she couldn't quite explain, a feeling of being watched. Evelyn took a few more steps into the room, the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the walls. Suddenly, something caught her eye. On the far side of the room, a small, faded photograph lay on the floor, partially covered by a sheet of paper. She bent down to pick it up, her fingers brushing the yellowed edges of the picture. As she held it up to the light, her breath caught in her throat. The photograph was old, its edges frayed and torn. It showed a group of nurses, their faces all smiling in front of the hospital. But what caught her attention wasn't the nurses. It was the figure standing in the back, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man. His face was obscured, but his eyes were wide open, staring directly at her. His expression was frozen in a look of sheer terror. And behind him, in the dim light of the photo, she could make out the faint outline of a figure, barely visible but unmistakably there. Evelyn's hands shook as she set the photo down on the floor. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in with an almost suffocating force. She had to get out. Spinning on her heel, Evelyn rushed for the door. But as she reached it, the whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her, growing more urgent, more frantic. Evelyn, her name again, and this time it was followed by a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves. Evelyn's pulse raced as she swung open the door and sprinted down the hallway. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, each step feeling like a countdown to something terrible. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it, like a cold hand pressing against the back of her neck. She didn't stop running until she reached the nurse's station. She paused for a moment, breathless and trembling, her mind reeling from what she had just seen. She couldn't explain it. The photograph, the figure, the whispers, everything felt wrong. And the more she tried to make sense of it, the more it slipped through her fingers, like trying to hold on to smoke. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening in this hospital, it wasn't just the result of a haunted building. There was something more, something darker, lurking in the shadows. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital itself was alive, and it was waiting for her. Evelyn stood at the nurse's station, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. The feeling of being watched, the whispering voices, still echoed in her mind, replaying over and over like a haunting refrain. She wanted to leave, to run, but something deep inside her urged her to stay. There was something she needed to uncover, something pulling her deeper into the hospital's forgotten corners. The station was empty, as it had been when she first arrived. The lights flickered above her, casting strange shadows across the room. She glanced around, half expecting to see a figure standing in the doorway or a shadow moving across the walls. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of dripping water from somewhere down the hall. She couldn't shake the image of the photograph from her mind. The man with the terrified eyes, standing in the shadows. Who was he? And why had he been hidden in the back of that photo? And the figure behind him, what was that? Evelyn's eyes wandered to the hallway leading further into the hospital. The dark, empty corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, disappearing into the shadows. She couldn't tell whether it was the darkness that made the place feel so ominous or if it was the weight of something far worse. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn stepped away from the station, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She couldn't stay here, not after what she had seen. She needed to find Dr. Hill. He had to know what was happening. He had to have answers. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A door, slightly ajar, at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't one of the rooms she had passed earlier. This one was different, newer, somehow, as though it had been sealed off for years and only recently reopened. Curiosity gnawed at her, and before she could stop herself, Evelyn found her feet moving toward the door. The whispers started again, faint at first, like a low hum in the distance, but growing louder with each step she took. It was as though the hospital itself was calling to her, drawing her closer. She reached for the doorknob, her fingers cold and stiff, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open with a soft groan, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was stale, and the only light came from a small, cracked window on the far wall. There was something unsettling about the room, something she couldn't quite place. Evelyn stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping over the walls. The room was bare, except for a single metal bed in the center, covered in dust. There were no medical instruments, no charts, nothing to suggest it had ever been used for patient care. Yet, there was an odd sense of familiarity, as if she had seen this room before. Her breath caught in her throat when her flashlight fell on the far wall. There, scrawled in faded red ink, was a single word: help. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The word was barely legible, as though it had been written long ago, but the message was clear. Someone had been here. Someone had left this cry for help, a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to hear it. Suddenly, she felt it, the presence. It was like a cold hand pressing against her back, sending a wave of fear rippling through her. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing, just the empty space, the broken bed, and the silent walls. Her pulse raced as she backed toward the door. She couldn't stay in here. Not after that. Not after what she had seen in that photo, heard in the whispers, and felt in the cold air. She needed to leave. She needed to find answers. But as she reached for the door handle, it slammed shut on its own, trapping her inside. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled at the door, her panic rising as she struggled against the force holding it shut. The coldness in the room intensified, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Evelyn could feel them swirling around her, pressing against her ears, urging her to listen. She spun around in the darkness, trying to make sense of the chaos in her mind. The walls seemed to close in on her, and she could almost hear the pounding of her own heart in the silence. The room felt alive, alive in a way that made her stomach turn. Evelyn. The whisper was louder now, right behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there, just the same empty room. But she could feel it, the weight of something in the air, the oppressive force that seemed to fill every corner of the space. And then she saw it. At the foot of the bed, something moved. A shadow. It was tall, towering over her, its form shifting and twisting in the darkness. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the figure took shape. A tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by shadows. But she could see the faint outline of its hands, long and twisted, reaching out toward her. She stumbled back, her hands fumbling for the door handle once more, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, its presence growing stronger, its form becoming clearer with every passing second. She could feel the cold emanating from it, like ice, spreading across the room. Help! The whisper again. It wasn't a plea for help this time. It was a demand. Command. Evelyn's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a haunting. It was something far worse, something that wanted her, something that needed her. She couldn't stay here, not like this, not with whatever was stalking her. With a final burst of energy, Evelyn pulled at the door one last time, her hands shaking with fear. The door flew open, and she stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. Evelyn didn't stop to look back. She ran down the hallway, her feet pounding against the cold floor. The hospital seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of corridors and rooms that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. The more she ran, the more disoriented she became, as if the very walls of the hospital were shifting around her. She had to find Dr. Hill. She had to find someone who could explain what was happening. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how many turns she made, the hospital seemed to swallow her up, its endless halls stretching out before her like an unbreakable maze. And all the while, the whispers followed her. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled down the endless hallways. The air was thick with a coldness she could feel deep in her bones. She didn't know how long she had been running. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? It felt like time itself had stopped, like the hospital was stretching around her, pulling her deeper into its dark maze. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath ragged, but there was nothing. No figure in the shadows, no towering presence behind her. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something lurking just out of sight. It was as though the hospital itself was alive, watching, listening, and guiding her with unseen hands. Every door she passed seemed identical, each one closed tight, each one just as empty and silent as the last. But every time she looked at one, it felt like it was whispering her name. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. Evelyn, the whisper came from somewhere ahead of her, too clear to ignore. She froze in place, her pulse quickening. This time, it wasn't a distant echo. It was close, too close. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, like they were being weighed down by invisible hands. The walls around her seemed to press in, narrowing the hallway, making her feel trapped. The whisper grew louder, more urgent, filling the air with an oppressive dread. "Help us!" It wasn't just one voice now. It was many, soft, pleading, overlapping like a chorus of ghosts begging for release. The walls seemed to hum with their voices, each one pulling her deeper into the darkness. She couldn't understand what they wanted, but the terror was so real, so overwhelming, that she felt like she might collapse under the weight of it. She turned a corner, hoping to find some way out, but the hallway stretched before her, the same as ever. The faint glow of the overhead lights flickered and sputtered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The temperature dropped even further, until she could see her breath in front of her, each exhale a visible puff in the cold air. Evelyn's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't focus. It was like the very building was closing in on her, suffocating her with its endless corridors and walls that refused to stop growing. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. But then, in the distance, something moved. Her head snapped to the side, her eyes wide with fear. She strained her ears, listening, but the footsteps were gone. She couldn't tell if it had been real, if it was just her mind playing tricks on her. The quiet stretched out, suffocating in its stillness. But then, a figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. Evelyn froze. She didn't move, didn't even breathe. The figure stood still, like it was waiting for her to make the first move. It was tall, too tall, its shape a shadow against the flickering lights. She could barely make out its features, but she didn't need to see its face to know it was not human. Its form seemed to ripple, like smoke or mist, as if it didn't belong in the real world. "Evelyn," the voice whispered again, this time sounding like it was coming from all directions, pressing against her eardrums, vibrating in her skull. It was no longer a plea. It was an order. "Come closer." Her feet felt rooted to the floor, her body unwilling to move, but the figure didn't step forward. It didn't need to. It was already there, all around her, in her mind, in her soul. She could feel it, like an invisible hand curling around her chest, squeezing the breath out of her lungs. And then the whisper turned to a growl, a deep, rumbling sound that made the walls tremble. "Help me," it rasped. Evelyn took a step back, her heart racing, her hands shaking. She didn't know if she could trust her own senses anymore. What was real? What was a dream? The hospital was shifting around her, warping into something monstrous, something that didn't want her to leave. But she couldn't stay. She had to get out. She had to find Dr. Hill. With all her strength, she forced herself to turn and run. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the pounding in her chest. The voices followed her, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't. She reached another corner, but instead of the hallway she was expecting, she found herself standing in front of a closed door. The handle was cold in her hand, but she didn't hesitate. She twisted it, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit, with a single flickering light bulb overhead. The walls were lined with old, forgotten equipment, some broken, some covered in dust. But what caught her attention was the desk in the center of the room. It was cluttered with papers, files scattered across the surface. And on the chair behind it, sitting motionless, was a man. Dr. Hill. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. He was sitting perfectly still, his head bent low, his face hidden in shadow. His posture was stiff, unnatural. She could feel her pulse quicken as she stepped closer, but something stopped her before she could reach him. A chill in the air, a presence in the room that made her stomach twist. "Dr. Hill," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. He didn't move. A deep sense of dread washed over her, as though she was intruding on something far darker than she could comprehend. She reached out, slowly, her hand trembling as it hovered near his shoulder. Before she could touch him, the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, growing darker, and the air grew colder, as though something was pressing in from all sides. She could hear the whispers again, louder now, more urgent, and in the back of her mind, something clicked. This wasn't real. Dr. Hill wasn't here. Not like this. With a gasp, Evelyn stepped back, her mind racing. The room, this whole hospital, it was a trap. A place where the past refused to die. A place where the dead lingered, pulling her into their world. And now she was stuck in it. Evelyn's heart was still racing as she backed away from the desk. The room seemed to close in around her, its walls pressing closer with each passing second. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like an effort. What was happening to her? Was this all just a nightmare? Or had she truly stepped into something far worse? She turned away from the desk, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the terrifying thoughts flooding her mind. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, but they weren't coming from the room. No, they were inside her head, echoing in her thoughts, making it harder and harder to think clearly. "Get out," they hissed. "Leave now before it's too late." But where could she go? The hospital stretched endlessly, its hallways twisting into labyrinths that seemed to have no end. Every door she opened led to another dead end. Every step she took led her deeper into the madness. As she turned to leave the room, something caught her eye. At the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows, was another door. It was different from the others, older, worn down, with strange symbols carved into the wood. The air around it felt wrong. There was something about it, something that pulled her in. A chill ran down her spine. She should have turned away. She should have left. But something inside her, some dark curiosity, compelled her to move toward it. Her footsteps echoed through the silent room as she approached the door. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if warning her to stop, but she couldn't turn back now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Her hand hovered over the handle, but she hesitated. Something told her this door was different, that whatever lay beyond it would change everything. But she couldn't stop herself. With a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open. Behind it was a narrow staircase, descending into a darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the further she looked, the more she felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her feet making soft thuds on the old wooden steps. The further she descended, the colder it became. Her breath fogged in the air, and her skin crawled with the feeling of something watching her. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. This was where the hospital's true horrors lay. Down here, in the depths, where no one had dared go for years. The stairs seemed to go on forever, each step creaking under her weight, each breath heavier than the last. Her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop herself from moving forward. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, until they were a constant hum in her ears. They were no longer just words. They were feelings, sensations that washed over her, made her skin tingle with dread. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the staircase ended. She found herself standing in front of a large, rusted door. It was unlike any door she had seen in the hospital, old, weathered, and covered in dark stains that almost looked like blood. The door seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were breathing in the darkness. Evelyn hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to leave this place before it consumed her. But her curiosity, her need to know what was hidden behind this door, pushed her forward. With trembling hands, she reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. She could feel the door resisting her, as though it didn't want to be opened, but she forced it. The door groaned in protest, its hinges creaking as it slowly swung open. What she saw on the other side made her blood run cold. The room beyond the door was vast, stretching into the darkness. But what made it even more terrifying was the shape of it. The walls were lined with old, rusted hospital beds, some of them occupied, others empty. The beds looked like they had been abandoned long ago, but there was something about them, something unnatural, that made her stomach churn. In the center of the room was a table, a single light hanging above it, casting an eerie glow on the scene. The air was thick with dust, and everything felt wrong. It was as if this room had been forgotten for decades, but at the same time, as if it had been waiting for her. And there, lying on the table, was something that made Evelyn's heart stop. It was a body. The figure was still unmoving, but the face. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The face was twisted in agony, its features contorted into an expression of pain and terror. It was someone she knew, someone she had seen before just days ago. It was Dr. Hill. Her mind reeled. How could this be? Dr. Hill was supposed to be safe, supposed to be the one person who knew what was happening. But this body, this lifeless corpse, was him. A sudden realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a hospital. It was a prison, a place where the spirits of the dead were trapped, forced to relive their final moments over and over again. And now she was one of them. Her chest tightened, the walls seemed to close in, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were screams, deafening and desperate. The spirits of the hospital were calling to her, begging her to join them in their eternal torment. Evelyn turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She screamed, pounding on the walls, but there was no escape. The room seemed to grow darker, colder, until all she could hear was the sound of her own breath and the pounding of her heart. And then the whispers stopped. A voice, low and guttural, spoke from the shadows. "Welcome to your new home." Evelyn's breath came in short, frantic bursts. Her chest felt tight as though the walls themselves were pressing in on her. The air in the room was thick with something she couldn't explain, something oppressive. She could still feel the lingering presence of the spirits, their eyes watching her from the corners, their whispers swirling around her like a tornado of fear. But that voice, it was different. It didn't come from the air around her. It came from the darkness itself. "Welcome to your new home," it echoed again, but this time it was colder, more threatening. The shadows deepened, making it harder for her to see anything but the eerie glow of the flickering light above her. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, but she forced them to move. She had to escape. She had to find a way out before she became like them. A trapped soul, doomed to wander this place forever. But as she turned toward the door, she saw something that froze her in her tracks. At the far end of the room, a figure stood in the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, but there was no mistaking the shape of it. A figure with a face, no, a mask. It looked like a human face, but it was twisted, distorted, its eyes hollow and empty. Evelyn stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen that face before. She had seen it on the walls of the hospital, on the old patient records she had uncovered. It was the face of the forgotten patient, a name that had appeared over and over again in the hospital's records, but one that no one had ever been able to place. A patient who had vanished long ago, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. But the rumors hadn't told her this. They hadn't told her that the forgotten patient was still here, still watching. The figure took a slow step forward, its feet making no sound as it glided across the room. Its eyes, those hollow eyes, seemed to lock onto hers, pulling her in, making it impossible to look away. "Evelyn," the voice said again, though the figure didn't move its lips. It was as if the voice was coming directly into her mind. "You were so close now, so close to understanding." She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was watch as the figure took another step closer, the shadows swallowing it whole, until only its glowing eyes remained. "You think you're the first," it whispered. "You think you're the first to see it. But you're not. We've all seen it. We've all been trapped here, in this place of endless night." Evelyn tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The terror was too great, the weight of it too heavy on her chest. Her body refused to obey. The forgotten patient stepped forward again, closer now. So close she could feel the cold, the bone-chilling frost emanating from its form. She could see its face clearly now, twisted into a grotesque grin that sent a wave of nausea through her. Its eyes, they were no longer empty. They were full of pain, full of regret, and something darker, something hungry. "There's no escape," the figure whispered. "You belong here now. You will join us." Her heart hammered in her chest, and a scream rose in her throat. But just as she opened her mouth to cry out, the figure vanished into the darkness. The room fell silent. The whispers stopped. The shadows pulled back, leaving her standing in the dim light of the table, with only the cold air and the echo of the words she had heard. No escape. Evelyn's mind raced. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. If she stayed, she would become one of them, trapped forever. But as she turned to leave, something stopped her. A sound, a whisper, faint but undeniable. She turned, expecting to see the forgotten patient again, but there was nothing. Only the empty hospital room. The silence was deafening. Then the whisper came again. "Evelyn." It wasn't the voice of the forgotten patient. It wasn't even the whispers of the spirits. This voice was different, soft, familiar. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She recognized it. "Evelyn," it was Dr. Hill's voice, but it sounded distant, like he was calling from far away. "You have to get out. It's too late for me, but you can still escape." She spun around, desperate to find him, but there was nothing, just the empty room. "Dr. Hill!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "Where are you?" What do I do? Don't trust them, the voice whispered again. They will try to keep you here. They will try to make you one of them. You have to go now. The room around her seemed to shift, the walls narrowing, the air growing heavier. She could feel something moving in the shadows, something watching, waiting for her to slip up. She couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't waste another second. But the words Dr. Hill had left her with were like chains, pulling her back, trapping her in the very place she wanted to escape. Don't trust them, the voice repeated, growing weaker. And then it was gone. Evelyn stood alone, trembling in the dim light, her mind reeling with confusion. She had to leave. She had to get out of this place before she lost her mind completely. But as she turned toward the door, she heard the sound of footsteps. Not hers, someone else's. The door swung open on its own, and she froze in terror. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall and imposing with glowing eyes. It was the forgotten patient. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the figure in the doorway loomed closer. The forgotten patient. His eyes glowed, piercing the darkness, and the air in the room grew colder with each step he took toward her. She tried to back away, but her legs felt weak, as though they were no longer her own. The figure moved closer, its face twisted in a permanent, horrifying grin. Evelyn's breath hitched. The rumors, the whispers in the hospital had all been true. This was no ordinary ghost. This was something worse. A soul trapped in torment, bound to the hospital for eternity. And now it was here to claim her. You shouldn't have stayed, the forgotten patient whispered, his voice deep and chilling, echoing in the silence. Evelyn couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, but the words wouldn't come. Her body shook with fear as she stood frozen, unable to escape. The shadows in the room seemed to press in, swallowing the light, until only the glowing eyes of the figure remained visible. The forgotten patient extended a hand, his fingers long and skeletal, reaching for her. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of his presence, and Evelyn could almost feel the coldness radiating from him, as if the darkness itself had taken shape. She closed her eyes, thinking of anything to escape this nightmare. But as she opened her eyes again, she realized the room had changed. The walls were no longer solid. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, becoming soft, like mud. And the faint whispers, those same whispers that had followed her throughout her time at the hospital, grew louder, swirling around her in a maddening cacophony. Then it hit her. She remembered what Dr. Hill had told her before he had disappeared into the darkness. You have to go now. Don't trust them. She could feel him, his presence, as if he was still out there, still watching over her. She couldn't let the forgotten patient take her. She had to find a way out. Evelyn took a deep breath, gathering all her strength. She turned toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The entire hospital seemed to shake, the walls creaking as if they were alive. The figure in the doorway began to advance, his glowing eyes narrowing. No, no, Evelyn cried out, backing away from the door. This is my escape. This is my way out. But the forgotten patient didn't listen. He only smiled, his twisted grin widening as he stepped closer. You cannot escape, he said, his voice low and menacing. We are all trapped here. Together. Evelyn's pulse raced. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the hospital itself pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The shadows stretched, reaching for her, crawling along the walls like dark tendrils. She had no choice. She had to act. In a moment of pure instinct, Evelyn bolted forward, sprinting toward the far end of the room. The figure lunged at her, his cold fingers brushing the back of her neck, but she managed to break free, crashing through a set of double doors. She ran down the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more urgent. She couldn't tell if they were coming from the spirits or from the walls themselves, but they were everywhere. The hospital was alive with them. Her lungs burned, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. As she turned a corner, she saw a familiar shape in the distance. The figure of Dr. Hill. He stood at the end of the hallway, his back to her. She called out to him, but he didn't turn around. He didn't respond. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he real? Was he truly there? Or was this another illusion? Another trap set by the hospital to confuse her? Desperate, Evelyn pushed herself harder, running toward him, her footsteps pounding against the floor. But just as she reached out to touch him, he vanished, disappearing into thin air like smoke in the wind. "No!" Evelyn screamed, falling to her knees in the hallway. The walls seemed to close in on her, the darkness crawling closer. Then, she heard it again, the whisper, soft but undeniable. "Evelyn." It was Dr. Hill's voice, but this time, it sounded different. It was gentle, calm. "You have to let go. You've done enough." Evelyn wiped the tears from her eyes, her hands trembling. She looked around, confused. "Let go," she whispered. "But I can't. I can't just leave you here. I can't leave you all here." The voice responded, but this time it was full of sadness. "This place, it's cursed. We're all cursed. But you still have a chance. You're the one who can break the cycle." Evelyn's heart ached. She didn't know if she could trust the voice anymore. But then she realized Dr. Hill was gone, and he was never coming back. This hospital, these spirits, they were all part of something bigger, something she didn't understand. But maybe she didn't need to understand. She needed to let go. As the whispers faded, Evelyn stood up, her legs shaky but determined. The hospital felt different now, quieter. The oppressive weight that had held her down for so long was beginning to lift. And then, as the first rays of dawn broke through the hospital windows, she realized something. She was free. The spirits were gone. The forgotten patient, the darkness, it had all vanished. She had escaped. But as Evelyn stepped outside, she took one last look at the hospital, the place where she had been trapped for so long. And in the distance, just beyond the gate, she thought she saw a shadow moving slowly, deliberately. Maybe this hospital wasn't done with her after all.